It all started with a dream.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century.
Sega, almost topping Nintendo with their Sega Genesis system, went downhill with the Sega Saturn for lots of reasons. I'll explain some of them now. It all started in E3 1995. Sega was ready to unveil their console, the Sega Saturn. Unbeknownst to them, Sony was also going to be at that conference, along with Nintendo, who didn't really have much to announce from their end, but Sony had a big announcement.
Some of you might actually want to know what that prize is. Since it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles, I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
Basically, the Sega Saturn, when it was shown off, was announced to be like $399, and it was gonna come out the very day of, which angered a lot of third-party developers because they weren't prepared for it to release so quickly. Whereas Sony, right after that, hit them with a big bomb. Due to that, the Sega Saturn was considered a commercial failure and basically dead on sight at that point. The issue with the Sega Saturn is their exclusive library wasn't very good. They didn't have a mainline Sonic game, all they had was a port of one of them. So that was already like their big mascot just out of the way. And they had some good ones like Knights and Panzer Dragoon, but not a lot to really wow gamers. It probably also didn't help Sega's case that they're already releasing like add-ons for the Sega Genesis while they were releasing their Saturn. Like, they had the Sega CD, the 32X, which was basically an add-on to make the Genesis more 3D. So that, like, even that kind of rivaled with the Sega Saturn, which kind of made sales a little hard to get at that point. And not only did they have to worry about Sony, they also had to worry about Nintendo, who later on would announce their new system, the Ultra 64, later than Nintendo 64. And while it didn't do as well as the PlayStation, the Nintendo 64 did surpass the Sega Saturn by a lot, so Sega knew that their system was not doing well, that they had to change things. And while it was still a success in Japan, it didn't fare well in other countries. Sega knew that it wasn't their future and that they had to move on to something else. Even their CEO, Bernie Stoller, said that, the Sega Saturn was basically history at that point and that it wasn't their future. The PlayStation was selling like hotcakes, so Sega needed to figure out a way to combat it and make the ultimate PlayStation killer in their eyes. So in a closed-door conference in 1998, Sega unveiled the Dreamcast to different media people, and a lot of people were pretty impressed by it, actually. In development, there were two different teams that worked on two different consoles. There was the Black Belt console and the Katana console. The Katana console was the one that eventually became the Dreamcast later on. It released in 1998 in Japan and September 9th, 1999 in the US and other places. Although there was one little shakeup in the Japan release. They didn't have enough units to sell to people, so the amount of units they could have gotten, they weren't able to get. Although they still got a substantial amount of units, all things considered. Early on, Sega Dreamcast was actually doing pretty good when it came to third-party games, as a lot of PS1 and N64 games would also get a Dreamcast release, which, you know, made their system more wannable because of that. It launched with a pretty decent amount of games too, like Sonic Adventure, Power Stone, Soul Calibur, Blue Stinger, and tons of other games I haven't mentioned that they already had ready right at launch. And Sega seemed to have learned their lesson with the Sega Saturn, because the issue with the Sega Saturn is that it's a very powerful system, but because they had to rush it to compete with the 3D of the PlayStation, it was really more meant to be a 2D powerhouse rather than a 3D system. Sega Dreamcast, on the other hand, made sure that the price was cheap enough for people to get, and also made sure that the chip for that system was easy to develop for. That way third-party developers didn't have issues with it. In PAL regions, they changed it to a blue swirl, changing it from the red swirl that was in every other region. Mainly because there was a German company that used the red swirl as its logo, and they didn't want to get into, you know, copyright issues with that. And surprisingly, it actually performed pretty well in sales for the first couple months. Although they did have an enemy looming on the horizon, and that was the PlayStation 2. Sega is performing well in many fields. They were one of the first game consoles to have online gaming, which was very revolutionary for the time, and things like Xbox Live would, basically be the spiritual successor to that. On September 1999, the same month that the Sega Dreamcast released in the US, Sony unveiled their PlayStation 2 conference, showing off different games and different things to it. It was going to be revolutionary. It was going to be the first console to have a DVD player within it, because the game peripherals use actual DVDs rather than the CD-ROM format that Sega Dreamcast and the original PlayStation used. Sega, however, had one game under their belt that they thought would rival the PlayStation 2 before it even released. The game I'm referring to is Shenmue.
Father! Stay back, mule. For the last time, where is the mirror?
So Shenmue was one of the pioneers of open-world games. It had a lot of communication with different characters, and even though the dialogue was, awkward, they also had a few other big releases like Jet Set Radio and Space Channel 9. Jet Set Radio is basically a game where you'd go around and spray graffiti on walls and everything, and then Space Channel 5 was a rhythm game where you play as a news reporter. Even with good exclusives, it wasn't enough to tame the beast that was the PlayStation 2, as it would end up releasing on October 2000. Not having a ton of exclusives or much to look forward to, but the fact that it was a cheap DVD player is what pushed it up pretty quickly, rather than the games themselves early on. Pretty early on after the PS2's US release, in March 31st, 2001, Sega announced that they were ending the console business, and they were going to go third-party. That wasn't the end for the Dreamcast, though, as it did have games like Sonic Adventure 2 and Phantasy Star Online to sort of hold over for the last year of the console. Even though its inevitable death happened, basically, the Dreamcast did revolutionize a lot of things, like online gaming, as I mentioned. And, a lot of consoles do some things that Sega also does. The Dreamcast, actually, even in, 1999, had a DLC for different games like Sonic Adventure. Like, they had a Christmas DLC, a New Year's DLC, and they were basically things you would download from the web and put them in your VMU, and it would change up the game. It was almost like an early form of that. You'd even get like different costumes in various different games as well. Different games and projects that were worked on for the Dreamcast ended up getting moved to different systems. Shenmue 2, the sequel to the popular Shenmue game, only released on the Dreamcast in Japan, as they thought it would be a better idea to release it in the States on the original Xbox. Jet Set Radio and Panzer Dragoon made their return on Xbox. Sonic made his return on pretty much all 3 consoles, and the rest is pretty much history. They also got Virtua Fighter for PlayStation. And while it may be discontinued and gone now, I do believe that the Sega Dreamcast really revolutionized the gaming industry for the time, and it's one of those black sheep systems where like a lot of people think it's a hidden gem because a lot of people like the style of it. A lot of people like the games that came from it. That's probably why some of the games got re-released on later systems. Just goes to show how good their exclusive library was. But that's about it for this video. I thought I'd give like a brief little history about the Sega Dreamcast and how it rose and fell. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Have yourselves a good one, and I'm out. Peace.